June 6, 1944, a grey day breaks over the Channel, revealing an awe-inspiring sight. Never had such an armada been seen in the history of mankind. On board 7,000 vessels, 130,000 men crossed the stretch of sea with air cover from 20,000 planes. At dawn, after a hail of fire, the men would land on the coast of France. 20,000 of them would also arrive by air. 10,500 Allied soldiers would be lost on that day and almost as many Germans. 11 weeks later, Paris would be liberated and the road to Berlin opened wide. This film will tell from the viewpoint of both Allies and Germans. This epic tale from its planning in Britain launched in January 1944 until its outcome in the summer. With the US generals, Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, and all the anonymous heroes who took part in the landings. Not to mention men like Sergeant Grant, who risked their lives filming it. They all participated in this staggering event, which, contrary to legend, was no victory march. December 1st, 1943, the Tehran Conference, 3 heads of state had just made a key decision. The satisfied-looking Joseph Stalin, supreme leader of the Soviet Union and its armies, at the top of the steps. Lower down, the concerned-looking British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. For 2 years, Stalin, Churchill, and US President Roosevelt had been struggling to reach an agreement on the invasion date in Western Europe. The outcome of the war and of the world would depend upon it. From the moment his country entered into the war with Germany in June 1941, the Soviet leader had been demanding the opening of a second front in the West to relieve the pressure on his troops alone against Hitler in the East. Meanwhile, influenced by Churchill, who feared attacking Germany head-on, the Anglo-Americans had vainly hoped to weaken the Axis by passing through North Africa in order to invade southern Europe via Italy. However, they were stopped short near Naples and were unable to advance any closer to Germany. For a long time, Roosevelt was hesitant. He didn't think his country was ready enough for such a huge operation. However, he now wanted to put an end to the Third Reich as soon as possible and to do so in the West. He also hoped to cooperate with the Soviets after the victory. Churchill could only resign himself to it. Since the United States had entered the war in 1941, Hitler had feared an invasion of the German-occupied west coast of Europe. In 1942, he began planning a gigantic operation, the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a continuous line of fortifications running almost 4,000 miles from northern Norway to the Spanish border, despite the fact that most Germans believed the Allies would try to land in the Calais region, only 25 miles from the British coast. The German authorities, therefore, requisitioned thousands of men, free laborists, Frenchmen in the compulsory work service, refugees, Jews, and prisoners of war, to carry out this outrageous project, which would require 13 million tons of concrete. As 1943 drew to a close, Fortress Europe seemed to be firmly in German hands. On January 15, 1944, having been handpicked by Roosevelt to lead the landings, Ike Eisenhower arrived in London to plan Operation Overlord. In effect, the stage is being set for the beginning of the great and crucial test all over the world. I am completely confident that the soldiers, sailors, and airmen and all the civil populations of the United Nations will demonstrate once and for all that an aroused democracy is the most formidable fighting machine that can be devised. A few days later, Eisenhower introduced his team to the press. As an American Supreme Commander, his second needed to be British. He, therefore, appointed as commander of the Allied ground forces, General Montgomery, alias Monty, hero of the Desert Campaign in North Africa against Rommel and much loved by his compatriots. The military leaders had their plan, but it had to remain top secret. Hence, the best pose in front of an illegible, faded map. As always, Monty tried to grab the limelight as he paid more attention to the cameras than to his colleagues' phony gesturing. In truth, despite all this tomfoolery, the leaders had already chosen France for the landings, but Normandy rather than the Calais region, because although the Normandy beaches were farther from Britain, they were less well defended. The invasion was planned for spring, between Ouistreham and Corentin, at the foot of the Cotentin Peninsula. However, Montgomery wanted to widen the front line so as not to get stuck in a small perimeter along the beaches. He also wanted to extend the front farther west to get closer to the deep water port of Cherbourg, which the Allies would need to seize in order to ensure the logistics of a huge army. Secrecy was paramount if they were to succeed. The Germans needed to be kept totally in the dark about the Allies' plan. Early in 1944, they were still unsure of where exactly the landings would take place. This was another reason to start spinning the big wheels of propaganda. Eisenhower's arrival in London nevertheless confirmed Hitler's fears of an invasion in the West. In 1942, he had appointed one of his most brilliant generals, the popular Erwin Rommel, to the rank of Field Marshal. After commanding the Afrika Korps, the so-called Desert Fox had thwarted the British time and time again, so it was only natural for the Führer to entrust this energetic soldier with reinforcing the defences of Fortress Europe. By early 1944, Rommel was in France. With the Nazi Air Force stationed in Germany to counter Allied bombing raids, he was unable to use it in Normandy. The theatre of war would be the land and the beaches, which he considered badly defended. He wanted to fill in the gaps between fortified towns with a continuous line of defence. He also asked for the coast to be more heavily mined. However, one mine is a mere drop in the ocean when you consider that from Calais to Lower Brittany, France has 750 miles of coastline. Rommel's new energy was little cause for concern for Eisenhower because for months, the British and Americans had been building artificial ports, which meant they didn't have to immediately capture a real port and had the flexibility to choose their point of attack. The Allies were not put off by this titanic task. These huge concrete caissoons, called phoenixes, would one day be towed off the Normandy coast, where they would be sunk to form the first breakwaters. As would these floating docks where tons of material and thousands of men would be unloaded once moored to the immense steel pontoons providing access to the beaches, whatever the level of the tide. A gigantic life-size construction toy devised in the ports of Britain. In Britain, training exercises continued. British and Americans used all available means, even though, once again, it was all for the cameras. Synchronized swimming and pyrotechnics were the order of the day. Material and equipment were also tested. Anti-mine tanks to clear the beaches, matting to cross the sand more easily, gymkhanas on wavy artificial roads to get used to these new jeeps from America, not to mention these new Churchill Crocodiles flame-throwing tanks, which would reduce to ashes anything that had been missed during bombing raids. The Allies had already lost several hundred men in exercises in Britain. Why choose such an extreme site in the deepest Cornwall? Despite the fact that the British 4th Commando Brigade was a battle-hardened unit, because every type of topographical scenario had to be envisaged. It's a well-known fact that the Americans never go into battle if the balance of power isn't in their favor. Hailing from Utah, Kansas, Ohio, Kentucky, how many of these young men had any idea? At 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the first assault waves hit the 5 Normandy beaches. On Utah Beach, American troops of the 4th Infantry Division were carried off course by strong currents but met surprisingly light opposition and moved inland quickly with fewer than 200 casualties. Farther east on Omaha Beach, the situation was catastrophic. Steep bluffs defended by well-entrenched German positions, combined with heavy seas that swamped many landing craft and scattered the troops, turned the landing into a bloodbath. Machine gun and artillery fire raked the beach. Hundreds of men were killed or wounded within minutes of stepping off their boats. Many drowned before reaching shore, weighed down by equipment. For several desperate hours, the Americans were pinned behind the shingle seawall with no way forward. General Omar Bradley, aboard his command ship offshore, seriously considered withdrawing the entire force. Yet small groups of determined soldiers, often acting on their own initiative, began climbing the bluffs, finding weak points, and silencing key German strongpoints. By early afternoon, the line was broken, and by evening the survivors had pushed several miles inland, though at a staggering cost of nearly 2,500 killed, wounded, or missing dead on the British and Canadian sectors, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The fighting was fierce but the progress steadier. Canadian troops at Juno advanced farther inland than any other Allied unit that day. British forces at Sword linked up quickly with airborne troops who had seized vital bridges during the night. By the end of June 6th, all 5 beachheads were established and roughly linked, Though none had reached the ambitious D-Day objectives set by Montgomery, Caen was still in German hands, and the push toward Cherbourg had barely begun. The Germans had been completely surprised. Rommel was away in Germany for his wife's birthday. Many senior officers were absent. Hitler's rigid command structure delayed the release of panzer reserves for critical hours. The Luftwaffe, already decimated by months of Allied bombing, could muster only a handful of sorties against the Armada. Allied air superiority was total. Over 11,000 sorties flown that day alone. The price was enormous. Allied casualties on June 6 totaled approximately 10,000, including 4,400 confirmed dead. German losses were comparable, though exact figures remain uncertain. Yet the foothold was secured. Over the following days, artificial Mulberry harbours were towed into place, supplies poured ashore, and reinforcements streamed in. The battle for Normandy would rage for another 10 weeks, through the brutal fight for Caen, the American breakout at Saint-Lô, Operation Cobra, and the encirclement at Falaise, but the decisive gamble of June 6 had succeeded. The road from the beaches of Normandy led straight to the liberation of Paris in August and, ultimately, to Berlin. The greatest amphibious invasion in history had not been a walkover, but it had opened the Western Front that would help bring the war in Europe to an end less than a year later.